Picture this, one of rock's most feared icons, Gene Simmons, the fire-breathing demon of Kiss, falls to his knees at a cemetery in Israel, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm so stupid," he cries. "Why didn't I go to see him?" This isn't the man who built a $400 million empire or conquered stadiums worldwide. This is a broken son, finally facing the father who abandoned him decades earlier. Behind the makeup, the money, and the mayhem lies a story so devastating it makes his stage persona look tame. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about Gene Simmons. Gene Simmons wasn't born a demon. He was forged by one of history's darkest chapters. His mother, Flora Klein, was just 14 when the Nazis ripped her from her Hungarian village and threw her into the machinery of genocide. Imagine watching your entire family disappear into gas chambers while you're barely old enough to understand what death means. Flora survived 3 concentration camps, including Auschwitz, witnessing horrors that would shatter most minds completely. But here's what's truly chilling: she was the only survivor. Her parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, everyone she'd ever loved was systematically murdered. The last words Flora heard from her grandmother were haunting: "Live and survive." Those words became a curse as much as a blessing. Flora carried the weight of an entire family's extinction on her teenage shoulders, and that crushing burden would later fall on her son. When the camps were liberated in 1945, Flora was hours away from being gassed herself. The Nazis planned to eliminate all evidence before the Americans arrived. She escaped death by mere chance, not choice. This survival guilt, the agonizing question of "why me?" poisoned every relationship she'd ever have. Flora rarely spoke about the Holocaust, locking those memories away so deep that even decades later, Gene had to uncover his family's tragic history through his own research. The trauma didn't die in those camps. It lived on, passed down like a genetic defect. Every time Flora looked at her son, she saw the faces of the family members who never got the chance to live. Gene wasn't just her child, he was carrying the dreams of the dead. But that overwhelming responsibility was nothing compared to what was coming next. Just when Flora thought she'd found safety, love, and a fresh start, her world collapsed again. Ferenc Witz seemed like salvation, another survivor who understood pain. They married in 1946, moved to Israel, and in 1949, little Chaim Witz was born in Haifa. For a brief moment, Flora believed she could build something beautiful from the ashes of her destroyed family. But Ferenc had demons of his own, and they were hungry. The marriage turned violent quickly. Gene's earliest memory wasn't of lullabies or bedtime stories. It was of watching his father strike his mother and biting his father's knee to protect her. Even at 6 years old, Gene understood he was the man of the house because the actual man had already checked out emotionally. Then came the abandonment that would define Gene's entire existence. Ferenc simply walked away. No explanation, no goodbye, no forwarding address. He left for Tel Aviv supposedly to find work, but really to chase other women. Gene later discovered his father was a serial womanizer with multiple relationships and children scattered across Israel. Ferenc didn't just leave, he erased them from his life like they never existed. Flora was now a single mother in a harsh new country, with no family support system and a traumatized past that made trusting anyone nearly impossible. She found work in a coffee shop, earning barely enough to survive. Gene spent most of his childhood with babysitters who spoke different languages: Turkish, Hungarian, Hebrew, Spanish, because his mother couldn't afford proper childcare. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. Flora had survived Nazi genocide only to be destroyed by the one person who was supposed to protect her. And 6-year-old Gene watched it all happen, learning his first and most devastating life lesson: the people who claim to love you will always leave. When Flora decided to immigrate to America in 1958, 8-year-old Gene thought they were escaping to paradise. Instead, they traded Israeli poverty for American poverty, swapping one struggle for another. They landed in Queens, New York, in a cramped apartment where the American dream felt more like a nightmare. Flora worked 6 days a week in a dress factory in Brooklyn, her days stretching from 6:30 a.m. to 9:30 p.m., including the brutal commute. Picture this: a Holocaust survivor, already broken by trauma and abandonment, now sewing buttons for pennies, while her young son sat alone in their empty apartment. Gene would wake up in the middle of the night, reaching for his mother, only to find cold sheets and darkness. The terror of those nights stayed with him forever. "I remember being scared and just crying and crying," Gene later recalled. "I cried so much that I cried myself to sleep." But here's the part that shaped everything. When morning came, Gene realized something that would drive his entire life: Crying was useless. The tears didn't bring his mother home faster, didn't put food on the table, didn't make the loneliness disappear. That's when something inside him snapped, or maybe hardened. He stopped crying. He stopped expecting comfort. Instead, he started obsessing over money, because he understood that poverty was just another form of abandonment. His mother wasn't choosing to leave him alone every night, she was forced to by their desperate circumstances. Gene began selling things as a child: wild fruit, homemade magazines, whatever he could hustle. While other kids played, he worked. While other kids had fathers, he had bills to worry about. The boy who would later claim money is the only thing that matters learned that lesson in the cruelest classroom possible, a tenement in Queens, where survival meant never depending on anyone else. By the early 1970s, Gene had transformed himself from Chaim Witz to Flora Klein to finally Gene Simmons, each name change another layer of distance from his painful past. But when Kiss formed in 1973, he discovered the ultimate disguise, literal masks that could hide the emotional scars no surgery could fix. The makeup wasn't just theatrical, it was therapeutic. For Gene, becoming the demon meant he could finally express all the rage, pain, and darkness he'd been swallowing since childhood. The blood-spitting, fire-breathing monster on stage was more honest than the man underneath ever dared to be. When he painted his face, Gene wasn't performing, he was disappearing. Think about the symbolism. A man whose father vanished without explanation chose to make himself unrecognizable for the next decade. Kiss performed in full makeup and costume from 1973 to 1983, and Gene's identity remained completely hidden from the public. He could walk down any street in America unrecognized, just like his father had done to him, invisible, untouchable, gone. The irony is devastating. Gene created a stage persona around being a demon, but the real demons were the ones he brought with him every night. The theatrical blood was fake, the emotional bleeding was constant, the fire he breathed was controlled, the burning inside him wasn't. The tongue that became his trademark was a weapon, a way to shock and intimidate audiences before they could abandon him first. Kiss became one of the most successful bands in history, but success couldn't fill the void left by a father who walked away. Every night, Gene would paint over his pain, strap on his armor, and become someone else entirely. The makeup wasn't hiding Gene Simmons from the world, it was hiding Chaim Witz from himself. But even demons can't run from their past forever. For decades, Gene sent money to his father in Israel. Cold, calculated payments that said everything and nothing at once. Here's cash. This doesn't mean I forgive you. This doesn't mean I need you. This just means I'm successful without you. It was the ultimate power move from a man who'd built his life on never appearing vulnerable. Ferenc would write letters thanking his famous son, praising Gene's children, and partner Shannon Tweed, trying to build bridges across an ocean of hurt. But Gene never responded. He never visited. He never picked up the phone. Pride had become his prison, and abandonment issues his warden. Ferenc died in 2002, and Gene didn't even attend the funeral. 9 years later, standing at his father's grave in Israel, the weight of that decision finally crushed him. When Ferenc's final letter was read aloud at the cemetery, Gene heard words that destroyed him. "My very dear son, in the beginning of my letter I must thank you for your very helpful support of me." The letter continued, filled with love and regret, but Gene couldn't hear anything except the echo of chances he'd deliberately thrown away. "I was so stupid," Gene sobbed, collapsing to his knees. "I don't know why I didn't go to see him." The cameras captured everything. The mighty Gene Simmons, reduced to a broken child crying for daddy. "I wanted to prove to myself and everybody else and to my father that I didn't need him," he later explained. "Once I proved it and became successful, I wanted to stand stubbornly on my pride. But what's the point of proving you don't need someone when they're already dead?" Ferenc had spent his final years alone with a Russian woman, just another stranger in a life full of abandoned families. The last letter from father to son would forever remain unanswered. Success didn't heal Gene's wounds. It just gave him better ways to hide them. By 2024, at 75 years old, the cracks in his carefully constructed persona were becoming impossible to ignore. His appearance as a guest judge on Dancing with the Stars became a masterclass in public humiliation, not because he was criticized, but because of what his behavior revealed. "This is difficult for me to figure out which one is more hot," Gene told contestant Danny Amendola about his dance partner. To another female dancer, he said, "You've fogged up my glasses, your beautiful face." The comments weren't just inappropriate, they were desperate. Here was a man in his 70s, worth $400 million, still trying to assert dominance through sexual commentary because emotional connection remained impossible. The backlash was swift and brutal. Social media users called him creepy and compared him to the gross uncle who corners you at the reunion. But Gene's response was telling. "I stand by every word I said." Even when caught behaving badly, he couldn't admit vulnerability or show growth. The same stubborn pride that kept him from his father's bedside now kept him from basic human decency. This wasn't his first controversy. Gene settled a sexual assault lawsuit in 2018, faced accusations from former Kiss guitarist Ace Frehley about inappropriate behavior toward his wife, and was even banned from Fox News for life after making staff uncomfortable. The pattern is clear: a man who learned that people leave, so he pushes them away first. At 75, Gene Simmons has everything he ever claimed to want: money, fame, power, but he's still that scared 8-year-old boy crying alone in a Queens apartment. The makeup may be gone, but the mask remains, and underneath it all, he's still waiting for someone to stay. December 6, 2018 marked the end of an era that few understood. When Flora Klein passed away at 93, Gene didn't just lose his mother, he lost his moral compass, his connection to history, and the last person who truly knew Chaim Witz before he became Gene Simmons. "Rest in peace, my dear Flora," Shannon Tweed posted on social media. "The best grandmother and mother-in-law I could have." But those words couldn't capture what Flora represented. She was the bridge between Gene's past and present, the keeper of secrets too painful to share, and the living reminder that survival sometimes costs more than death. The cruel irony of Flora's passing was what Gene discovered afterward. In 2020, German archives presented him with over 100 pages of documents about his mother's Holocaust experience: concentration camp records, Red Cross files, liberation papers. For the first time, Gene saw the full scope of what Flora had endured and hidden from him. She had carried those secrets for over 70 years, taking them to her grave rather than burden her son with more pain. "I knew almost nothing," Gene admitted, breaking down as he read his mother's impact statement, describing her time in Ravensbrück, Venusberg, and Mauthausen. She had been hours away from execution when American forces arrived. Every day of Gene's existence was borrowed time from a woman who had already survived the impossible. Flora appeared regularly on Gene's reality show Family Jewels, charming fans with her thick Hungarian accent and obvious devotion to her son. But beneath that sweet grandmother exterior was a woman who had witnessed humanity at its absolute worst and somehow still found reasons to love. When she died, Gene called her the best mother in the world, my mentor, my moral compass. Now that compass was gone, leaving him more lost than ever. The greatest tragedy of Gene Simmons isn't that he survived childhood trauma, built a fortune, or became a rock legend. It's that he spent his entire life running from the very thing that could have saved him: genuine human connection. The boy who was abandoned by his father became a man who abandons others first, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of isolation. In 2024, Kiss played their final show, ending a 50-year career that defined Gene's identity. "That's enough," he said. 50 years is enough for anybody. But what happens when the music stops, the crowds go home, and the makeup comes off for the last time? What's left when you've spent decades being someone else? Gene Simmons is worth $400 million, has sold over 100 million records, and influenced countless musicians. He survived poverty, abandonment, and the weight of carrying Holocaust trauma. He built an empire from nothing and became one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment history. By every measurable standard, he won. But victories ring hollow when you have no one genuine to share them with. Gene's recent controversies, his inability to form authentic relationships, and his stubborn refusal to show vulnerability reveal a man still trapped by childhood wounds that money can't heal. The fire-breathing demon was always just a scared little boy who learned that people leave, so walls were safer than bridges. Flora Klein survived Auschwitz to give her son life. Ferenc Witz abandoned that life to chase his own desires. And Gene Simmons spent 7 decades caught between survival and surrender, never quite learning how to trust, never quite healing from being left behind. The heartbreaking tragedy of Gene Simmons isn't what happened to him, it's what he's still letting it do to him. Behind every mask, there's always been that 8-year-old boy, crying himself to sleep, waiting for someone to come home.